Brandon Payne is founder and CEO of Accelerate Basketball, an NBA player development specialist, and the personal development coach for Steph Curry since 2011. Payne has personally trained over 100 NBA, WNBA, and foreign professional athletes and has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, CBS Sports, Bleacher Report, NBA TV, and many other media outlets. Accelerate Basketball also works extensively with youth basketball, and he is involved in the Underrated Tour created to showcase players like Steph Curry, who may be under the radar. Brandon, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, this is exciting, and there's a lot of ways we can go. And obviously, everyone wants to talk about Steph, but we want to make sure we focus on not just Steph, but shooting in general and youth coaching and development of players at all levels. But one of the great, ways to phrase your job that I saw was calling you a caddy for a great golfer. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, it's when you've been with somebody for, this is 12 years with Steph. When you've been with somebody that long, you really get you get immersed, if we're using a pun there, we get immersed in his mechanics and you kind of know when things, are off just a little bit. And with Steph at this point, just by the flight of the ball, I can tell what's going on at his feet or what's going on at his ankles. We do things from a shooting standpoint from the ground up. So, my belief is that your hands are some of the parts below your waist. And so a lot of times when most people are watching the flight of the basketball, I'm watching your feet first. So, just cueing him and just reminding him of certain things, how his weight is distributed underneath his feet, where he's placing power in his toes, just how things are looking sequentially up through his shot. We've got a really good, way of communicating about that. And when things need to be corrected, we can make those corrections pretty quickly.
Well, I love that concept of cueing. I think that's such an important point for coaches to dive deeper into. And that is this concept of when you teach shooting, it's actually detrimental to give feedback on every repetition. And can you talk a little bit about that process of not giving repetition, not just to Steph, but to other players as well?
Well, yeah, shooting and teaching and coaching shooting it's a very individualized thing. One of the things I tell all shooters and all parents and all coaches is that shooting mechanics are as individual as your fingerprint. And no two shooters are going to shoot the basketball alike. And there's so many things that go into the mechanics of the shot, mainly just joint operation, whether the joints can operate, like I said, sequentially, or whether there's a dysfunction of the joint, or whether there's an injury history, or there's some asymmetrical power output. All those things go into shooting a basketball. And if you're constantly giving verbal feedback, if you're constantly picking things out, and most of the time, the most feedback I hear is all about the finishing portion of the shot, you're missing the process that actually creates the shot. Like I said, the hands are just, they're the sum of the parts, and everything you do above your waist, typically for young shooters, is all about, compensating movement patterns for a bad movement that's going on underneath their hips. So, you've got to really watch and take in what's going on with each shot. And then, about every 5 to 10 shots, based off of the experience level of the player and the age of the player, you can start to cue them or give them some mnemonic devices or some things to kind of remind them of what they're trying to accomplish. And, but if you're doing that on every shot, you're going to end up banging your head against the wall, because not a whole lot good is going to come from that. And the player is going to get frustrated, and you're going to get frustrated in the process.
And that's in part because shooting is as much of a feel as it is an actual mechanical operation. And you talked about individualization then. With this cueing, is the individualization, is it like words and ideas that are specific to the player, or do you find you use the same phrases or the same cues for certain players?
Some of the cues are verbal, some of them are physical. So, we use mobility sticks and resistance bands and anti-rotation cueing movements to sometimes help players remember not to use thoracic rotation to compensate for poor foot patterns. There's other bands and there's other things that we use to give players some external stimulus to remind them of things. So cueing takes on a lot of different forms. Most of the time, it can be verbal when you've got a guy like Steph, but even last week when I was in Golden State with him trying to work out that little funk that he was in, it was a lot of physical cueing. It was a lot of physical reminding. And we, we had pretty good success with it after we went through it.
Talk quickly about these training props that you've mentioned, not specifically what ones, but more in the concept of the problem with training props potentially is it becomes obviously a hindrance, because this guidance isn't there in a game. So can you talk a little bit about how you remove the guidance as well as use the guidance in terms of helping the player?
Yeah, it depends on how intelligently you use it and your understanding of the neural response to the stimulus, and understanding that it's done in short bursts. So for us, when we use the bands and the mobility sticks for the anti-rotation stuff, it's typically done in about a 10-second stint. So he'll shoot about 5 or 10 shots, and then we'll go through a dynamic anti-resistance, anti-rotation resistance with the band, with him holding the mobility stick vertically for about 10-15 seconds, and then we go right back to shooting. So it's just a physical cue to remind him not to rotate. There's some things we do below the waist as well, especially if players are getting into a valgus pattern, where we use mini bands and things like that for, again, 10 to 15 second stints, and then you remove it, and then you go right back to shooting. Using tools in the middle of shooting, I don't do a lot of that unless it's absolutely necessary. But using things to do physical cueing, we use a lot of that.
So you mentioned feet first, and feet being such an important part of the shot. Can you give us some examples of some of the cues that are important to you? And then maybe with that, do we care if the feet are square or not? Does that matter?
It quite frankly depends on your ability to move thoracically. It depends on your lumbar spine. It depends on your ability to sequence from the ground up. I mean, you can't say that this player should or shouldn't until you've really evaluated their movement patterns. So it depends on the player, quite frankly. But some of the cues are important to us from a foot standpoint. Making sure that the shooter is always playing between their arches. If anything gets out towards their fifth metatarsal, not only are you going to be you're probably not going to make a lot of shots because your balance is going to be up. And number two, you're increasing your risk for injury. So for me, loading the big toes evenly, making sure that your big toes are driving and loaded equally from side to side is very important. If one foot is loaded more than the other, you're going to get into a lot of compensating movement patterns up through the shot. So you're not going to be a very consistent shooter. So for us, that and heel height. So when you leave the ground, you want to make sure that both heels are leaving the ground at the same angle, at the same speed. If you notice, a lot of young shooters, their heel height changes, or one heel is higher than the other at the start of the shot. So that means everything up the pattern is going to be off. So those are things that I'm looking for when we're looking at shooters. And then we have a lot of arch activation tools that we use, and arch activation drills that we use to help players start that shooting sequence correctly.
So it's fascinating to hear you talk about the heel. So what you're basically referring to is that one leg pushes harder than the other leg. So there's an imbalance.
So it's asymmetrical power output. So one leg is driving more than the other. And a lot of times with a shooter, that ends up in rotational force. So you'll notice that hips rotate, feet rotate, and then you get into this thoracic compensating pattern where they try to correct the footwork issues with everything that's going on above their waist. They try to turn their chest. There are some players that can do it. Stephen is one of them. But those players are few and far between. So you want to make sure that you're as sound as you possibly can be from the ground up as a shooter. Because if you're not sound from the ground up, again, everything you do above your waist is just compensating.
Very cool. And with that, I've seen you say the phrase in one of the articles, push the ground harder, in reference to Steph, mm-hmm. Right? So can you talk a little bit about that, because that applies to what you're talking about?
Yeah. So when we get into these extremely deep shots, and the things where we're 30 plus feet away from the rim and we're taking those shots, the biggest cue to keep him from pushing the basketball or throwing the basketball is to drive the ground and to drive it vertically. So we talk to him about pushing the ground harder, not only pushing the ground harder, but make sure that he's going from his shoulders to his ears through the roof. because sometimes when people drive the ground harder, they'll end up in this hinge pattern where their ears get in front of their shoulders and they're basically throwing the basketball. So push the ground harder, keeping your shoulders and your ears vertical through the roof. Those are the cues we use when we get into those really deep shots, because again, everything about the shot comes from the ground. The rotation, everything comes from the ground. So just driving your feet in the ground harder is going to give you more range, and it'll make that shot sequence a little bit smoother.
So to be able to keep this symmetrical push off of the ground, is there some simple ideas that you can give us without any devices or whatnot that we can kind of think about?
Yeah. So it really is, for a lot of young kids, it's more about understanding how their foot actually works and doing some single leg balancing drills, just teaching them how to locate what we call their tripod, which is their big toe, pinky toe, and heel. Learning how to locate their arch through that tripod. We do things, and we still do them with Steph to this day. Very simple, just standing on one foot, just wrapping around your waist 5 to 6 times in one direction, 5 to 6 times in the other direction, then repeating that same action with your eyes closed in each direction, just to learn how to use your arch to activate all of the balancing tools that your body has within itself, and doing that with both feet. And then anytime that you're getting into a strength program, make sure that you're getting into it from the standpoint of, getting a movement screen first, understanding where your imbalances are, doing a lot of single leg movements as corrective action is not. And then once you get through the corrective action, then increasing the load on the single leg movements to make sure that you're not creating one leg stronger than the other. That's a big thing with players, especially when they're in relatively simply designed strength programs where they're squatting, or heaven forbid if they're doing leg press or whatever. A lot of times those imbalances are magnified by doing those types of movements, because subconsciously they don't know it, but one leg is driving harder than the other, and that has a direct impact on your shooting mechanics. Shooters are made and corrected in the weight room. Bottom line, shooters are made and corrected in the weight room because movement patterns make shooters. And if you're not doing things correctly there, you're going to run into problems as a shooter on the floor.
So an awareness of the body is
absolutely
part of it.
Yeah, I mean that's understanding how the body works sequentially from the ground up is paramount as somebody that is trying to help shooters make corrections. If you don't understand what the joint above and below the joint dysfunction's responsibility is, you're going to have a hard time making long-lasting corrections. You can make corrections that might last through a workout. You can make corrections that might last through a week or two. But until you actually address the movement issue, the poor mechanic is going to end up coming back. And so understanding how to make those corrections, again, off the court to perform better on the court is going to be, it's essential to making quick corrections for shooters.
So you've talked about this, and you're just referring to it there too, this summation of joint forces, understanding how the body works together. Mm-hmm. And, it's an oversimplification, but it's basically that shooting should feel more effortless than effortful. Correct. Right. Mm-hmm. So can you connect us a little bit with how you get young athletes to be able to understand that beyond just, and again, if we think about it in a weight room situation, you're talking about them being able to understand how it's less effortful to be able to lift or move their body. So can you talk about it in the shooting in the gym context, maybe?
Yeah, so we talk about it from a shooting standpoint that the shot starts with your toes and it finishes with your fingertips, and there is no break in the action from the start to finish. It's one movement, and it's one sequential movement. And by explaining what is going on to the players at their ankles, at their knees, at their hips, and how their stomach, how to be vertically stacked through their core, so they're not getting into a hinge pattern or a hunch pattern while they're shooting. That's a big thing with young players, understanding vertically stacked core, and just explaining what the job of every joint center is doing and what the job of the core is doing. I think it helps players be a little bit more detailed in their process on the court. The one thing that Stephen Curry does better than any other player I've ever worked with is he asks the best questions because he cares about the information. And once you understand what's going on, and this of course happened through the multiple ankle injuries that we dealt with early in his career, he really took the time to learn about his foot. He took the time to learn about his ankle. I mean, specifically about the ligaments, tendons, and their function and their job, and how it affects things going up the chain. And when you have a player that's that detailed in their knowledge, they're going to be detailed in their work as well. And so helping to educate your players on how they move and what correct movement feels like and looks like will help them understand how to be a better shooter and how to have that footwork flow and finish. That's one of the things you hear me say, like footwork flow and finish. It starts at your feet, it flows through your body, and it finishes through your fingertips. Footwork, flow, and finish. And you've got to have those things, those components to be a really good shooter, but understanding your body is a huge part of that.
So you've had this advantage of working with the greatest shooter of all time, arguably. What have you learned from that has made you a better coach of less effective shooters?
Precision, and not settling for anything less than precision, and holding yourself accountable. Every shot matters. There's no such thing as a wasted rep. Every shot is either taking you forwards or backwards. And competing, the importance of competition in shooting. I've gotten to the point now to where we don't do just any shooting around anymore. Now everything we do is competitive. Everything we do is either against a score number or against time. And you have to feel that little bit of competitive pressure on every shot, and you have to hold yourself accountable when you don't succeed within your shooting competitions. And finding ways to continue to layer on difficulty. But the biggest thing, that we've really started to do is understanding the value of doing heart rate match shooting. Understanding that the value of low heart rate shots is pretty low. You've got the match game heart rate in order for those shots to really have value in workouts. So just trying to recreate the game environment as much as you can in workouts without putting a lot of extra miles on your player's body. And finding creative ways to do that has been a big part of how we've been successful every off season. And I think that we've still got a long way to go. He's not going to be done anytime soon. So we're going to continue to evolve and try to stay one step in front of him. That's a hard thing to do, but we got to continue to find ways to challenge him and be competitive.
It's awesome. You mentioned obviously heart rate math, this your heart's intuition, and then being able to replicate that in game condition. Mm-hmm. And I know you also reference breathing as something that's extremely important to you. So can you give us some perspective on how breathing is so important to shooting?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's important. First off, from being able to get that heart rate to come back down, in timeout situations or free throw situations, we go through some diaphragmatic breathing exercises with him several times a week, whether we're actually loading the diaphragm or whether we're doing some specific exercises where we're giving him breathing patterns to work through on his stationary ball handling drills. Breathing is a big part of our success with him being able to get that heart rate under control in game situations. And for us, the diaphragm really has to be the primary driver of your breathing patterns, because if you get into a situation where your core muscles are really helping your lungs and helping your breathing patterns, then they get a little bit weaker for your shooting mechanics. So if your core muscles get fatigued from aiding the breathing patterns, they're not going to be able to do their job quite as well when you're being a dynamic shooter. Your vertically stacked core kind of starts to crumble a little bit when your core starts to get weak. So making sure the diaphragm is doing its job to free up the core muscles to do their job from a mechanics standpoint is very important for us, and it's something we pay attention to.
It's great stuff. And you mentioned already this competition and applying competition to shooting, but I know something else is very important to you is that you don't want to have, these blocked repetition of shot after shot from the same spot. You're a big believer in random practice at all levels, not just Steph Curry, but at youth levels as well, which is a point that I want you to emphasize for us.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be wildly variable, right? It just adding variability into your shot. So with our young players, I've got two sons. I've got a 14-year-old and 11-year-old, and they're really good shooters. But even with their workouts, something as simple as we call it working in ladders. So we work, in either a 3 or 4 rung ladder. You can start with a 2-rung ladder where it's literally just one step in, one step back, one step in, one step back, just to add some variability to it, because it's not very difficult for shooters to get really grooved at one range. And once a shooter starts to get mechanically grooved at one range, they do start to lose touch and feel at other spots. And so to add just slight variability to what you're doing it goes a long way into their ability to continue to develop touch. And touch is something you have to work on constantly. It comes and goes just like anything else if you're not touching on it and doing drills and things that are going to help you achieve a better touch on the basketball. So not only that, but also, variability from how you're picking up the ball on shots off the dribble, whether it's a right hand pickup, left hand pickup, crossover between your legs, behind your back. We work in multi-angle variability as well. So with Steph, we call it shooting the face of the clock. So if you're looking down on the clock and Stefan's the middle of it, we've got something we can do to get to 3 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 1, 7. We can get to all points on the clock, creating space and getting shots off. And we do that. We work in that variability like that to where we're not moving him a lot, but we're also not allowing him to stay at the same range. And we're forcing him to be dynamically stable as a shooter, which mimics game conditions as well. So it goes back to being vertically stacked, not getting into extension or flexion through your core, staying vertically stacked, ears over shoulders.
Well, I'm glad you made that point about it doesn't require us to have them come off of 100 different screens to make it random and variable. It's just a little bit of variation.
And I would argue that doing a whole lot of curl footwork, pop footwork, fade footwork at a young age continuously, it might not be as productive as you would like for it to be, because those are mechanically difficult shots for a lot of young players. So making sure, of course, you've got to mix it in some, but you've got to make sure you're getting quality reps, not only with the shot, but with the footwork and the movement as well. And for players to do that over and over and over again is difficult. Number one, their work capacity just isn't there to be dynamically stable like that in those footwork patterns. But number two, it's a quality over quantity type thing. You want to make sure you're shooting high quality shots, not just a high number of shots. So in order to be able to get your rep ranges up in the higher numbers, just doing simple variability stuff like 3-rung ladders where you shoot a 17-foot 19 shot, 19-foot shot, 21-foot shot, and you go back down the ladder. Just doing that and going to a specific number, for us, we do a lot of stuff where we say, we don't let anybody shoot anything less than 70% against air. I just don't believe if you can't make 7 out of every 10 shots you shoot against air, that there's a lot of work to be done. So we do 3-rung ladders to 7 out of 10. If you don't get 7 out of 10, then we're going to do the ladder again. And then we move on to another one.
And it also speaks to the game changing, right? There's very few players that shoot the ball like Steph anymore in terms of coming off of screens and curling and shooting. And it just isn't as big a part of the game anymore. So that might indicate that it's more of a late development skill for shooters anyway. So at the young age, we should focus on more step into the shot type of shots based on that.
Well, so step in is okay, but we teach a lot of vertical footwork because the game has become a space creation game. And if we always have shooters that are always 1-2 to the basket, then they're going to create even more space, because if their final step is always to the basket, whatever space they just created, they're going to eat one step of that on their own. So we teach a lot of 1-2 step, but we do it vertically, basically where the feet are replacing itself. And then we teach 1-2 laterally, 1-2 away, and then 1-2 to the basket. But teaching variability in that 1-2 step to me is very important. Also working on a 2-step, a hop catch is important. But I like to make sure we stay away from creating momentum shooters. Momentum shooters to me are shooters that always have to be 1-2 to the rim as a shooter. So working through vertical footwork is important, because again, as the game becomes more of a space creation off the dribble game, you make it harder if you're always having to finish to the basket, because like I said, you're eating the space that you just created to get that shot off. So making sure that you're becoming a vertical shooter is important.
Well, it's great, because that also applies what you talked about with the feet, which is this action reaction, the laws of physics and Newton's third law, where you're driving your feet. And if you're doing that long step into it, you're losing that. And the quick 1-2, which is what you're talking about, getting your feet down, that helps you keep this momentum that you're talking about, correct?
Yeah. And with, we do a lot of film with young shooters where we do a vertical 1-2 step where we want your foot to go right back where it just came from. We don't want to step forward at all. We want to make sure that you're vertically stacked from your ankles to your knees, to your hips, to your shoulders, to your ears. When we get to full extension, when you get to triple extension, and we don't want to see you moving forward a lot. So we want to teach you how to get power out of the ground vertically to get that shot off.
I've always talked to shooters about that. You You don't shoot quickly, you prepare to shoot quickly. And can
Correct.
you talk about those components of preparation that are so important for shooters?
Absolutely. I mean, if when you're in catch and shoot situations, the shot is made and the space is created before you ever catch the basketball. And that's the one thing that Stephen has done so well and so effectively as a relocation shooter in the NBA is a lot of times the space that he creates to get a shot off is created on the other side of the floor. His change of pace, his ability to be physical, his ability to bump and release on one side of the floor and then come off screens on the other side of the floor is a lot of what's made him effective as somebody that's doing that. So if you're waiting to do your work right before the catch, or if you're trying to do your work after the catch, you're making your job very, very difficult. And so understanding change of pace, understanding how to be physical, understanding court geography and how the ball moves in your offense is a big part of shot preparation. So there's a high IQ element that goes into shot preparation. And then, of course, catching with your hips loaded, getting your thumb under the basketball and getting that thing up and out quickly. That becomes just the finishing component of doing your work before you catch it. So yeah, shot preparation is a huge component of a successful shooter and something that I don't know if enough young players value. I don't know if they understand why to value it. Because so much now they see is off the dribble, and they don't realize how difficult that shot is yet.
Well, that's a Steph problem for all of us too, that the shot off the dribble has become such an important part of the game. So maybe let's go to there then. Let's talk a little bit about shooting off the dribble, the footwork, the ball pickup, anything else that stands out for you.
Yeah, I mean, when you're shooting off the dribble, it's a reaction. So, and it's something where we're reading and reacting. And Steph has three main reads he makes on every defender. And, basically the defender takes something away, it gives something up. And the reads are the defender's nose, where the defender's nose is in relationship to the middle of the midline of their body. And of course, hands and feet, their hands are down. There's a shot there. If they declare a high side foot, we know which hip to attack. But basically, we're just taking what the defender's giving, because everybody wants to take something away. And every time you take something away, you give something up. But not only that, not only understanding what's going on with the defender in front of you, but understanding the help concept behind the defender. Because sometimes if there's a weak help concept behind the on-ball defender, then you can make a move as a shooter and actually draw the help closer and create an opportunity for a teammate. So shooting off the dribble is not only a very effective tool for a guy like Stephen as a scorer, but it's also a very effective tool for him to get other guys open, because the gravity of him off the dribble really changes how people play defense, and it creates opportunities for other players on his team. And he's really learned how to use that as an effective ball distribution tool as well as a shooting tool. But it is a difficult thing. It is there's a lot of strength involved in being an effective shooter off the dribble. There's a lot of strength involved in being able to create space laterally or stepping back. And again, being sound mechanically when you get to that landing point, and creating that clean sight line, which is all those components are things that a lot of young shooters I don't think completely understand. There are some young players that are very gifted and they're physically more advanced than other players at that age, and they can do it. I see it, on the weekends when I'm with my kids playing. There are some kids that absolutely can, but the vast majority cannot do it well. And the vast majority are introducing mechanical issues by continuing to try to do it well when they don't. And it kind of goes back to it. If you're shooting that step back against the air, that side step against the air, and you can't make 7 out of 10 of them against the air, it's probably not something you should be doing in a game. And, I would argue that there aren't a lot of kids that are shooting that shot against the air at 70, 80% clip.
Nor should they be. But that's a different story. You said, I want to make sure I get this, the three main reads. You said nose, the hands and feet. What was the third
nose,
one?
hands, and feet. Yes, nose, hands, and feet. So
those all three together. Okay, I got you. Yeah, just want to make sure I get that. And then, so when you're talking about shooting off the dribble, it's the 1-2 footwork that you want, the same as what we talked about in terms of vertically shooting?
Well, no, I mean, then to shoot off the bounce and like that, I mean, you've got to be able to land on two occasionally. Sometimes you have to go through what we call a backwards footwork pattern. So instead of being a left-right footwork pattern guy as a right-handed shooter, sometimes you're going to be right-left. Understanding that sometimes that 1-2 step is going to be backwards instead of forwards, it's going to be to the side. So that's why you have to work on so much footwork variability in your workouts, because in a game, getting to that same 1-2 step is going to be very, very difficult. The big things is for us, again, is to make sure your nose stay behind your toes, your ears stay over your shoulders. You don't get into this hinge pattern or this really defined fade pattern. And what a really defined fade pattern is when your ears get back behind your shoulder and you actually shoot a faded shot. And if you do shoot a faded shot, to make sure you're fading straight back and not fading at an angle. If you fade at angles, it changes the entire mechanic of the shot. Fading straight back just changes how long you hold the release. So those are the things that we talk about when we're talking about being a dynamic shooter.
I'm just going to say this again. There's no perfect form and there's no one perfect footwork. And that's really what you're saying. No. There needs to be variability and understanding of all the different types of footwork, because you're going to apply them in some way.
And it's like I said, every shooter is as individual as his fingerprint. There's no, shooter A versus shooter B can have the same level of effectiveness with different footwork patterns. They can also, they can have things they go to that are completely different and have the same level of effectiveness. The biggest thing for me is making sure that players have what I call mirrored footwork, which means if you can do it in one direction, you got to be able to do it going in the other direction. So if you can hit a sidestep jumper going left with your left hand and a left step, you got to be able to do the same thing going right, because intelligent teams start to pick up on those patterns. Intelligent coaches start to pick up, well, he doesn't shoot very well going to the right. So, as long as we just force him back to the right side and let him take that side step right, he's probably going to miss. So, and young players don't understand the power of scouting and how much scouting can take away from their strengths when their strengths are really narrow and they're focused. When you have mirrored footwork, your strengths can be very broad and things are very difficult to take away. So making sure you're working on whatever you do going left, you got to be able to do going right. And for a lot of right-handed shooters, that side step and step back is much more comfortable going to the left side, just because it's a more natural pickup into the shot pocket. But you've got to work through things that are uncomfortable in order to get better going to the right side, because again, intelligent teams and intelligent coaches are going to start taking your strengths away from you sooner or later.
Last part on shooting off the dribble, then, just to dive a little bit deeper in terms of the actual ball pickup. Are you teaching anything specific in terms of hands and how to pick up the ball, say off the right dribble versus the left dribble?
For us, we don't like to be right-hand reachers. So for me, I like to make sure that the ball is brought from the left side to at least the midline of the body to get it up. I know it's difficult to get it all the way to the right, completely to the right side on the pickup. But as long as you're getting it to the midline on the pickup point, that's important for us. Big things for us is the path the ball takes on the pickup, specifically when it goes between the legs and behind the back, to make sure you're not having to reach back to pick the basketball up on those moves. So making sure when you go between your legs, instead of going under your butt, you go under your knee. It's a shorter path to the basket. So it's going to be just a shorter path to the pickup. So just paying close attention to those things. So that's what we use our stationary ball handling for, is really to work on defining that ball path that we really want it to take up into your shot. So everything you do from a stationary ball handling standpoint has to be done in the context of shooting. And that's how we work through it.
Well, and I'll go there because I want people to understand, because I can guess that this is the point, is that a lot of the pregame warm-up stuff we see Steph doing is really about comfort. Having him be confident and having him be comfortable. But in your workouts, you're trying to challenge him constantly to struggle and fight through it, right?
Well, there's a lot of overload in his pregame warmups too that's designed to be a neuroactivator. And, so there's some comfort there, but you've got to make sure that there's some overload and some stimulus within that warm up to make sure that you start to get the brain firing, the brain and body firing together.
Can you give us an example of an overload so coaches understand what you're talking about?
2 basketballs. 2 basketballs is an overload. And so the point of that is to overload what is normally 1 ball with 2 basketballs, and it causes a greater response from the brain. And that's what we're trying to do. Your brain has to be warmed up just like your body does. So the overload aspect of that is huge. And that's what you use 2 basketballs for. That's what you use tennis balls for, is to overload what is normally a 1 ball movement with something additional to get the brain firing at a higher velocity, a higher speed. And once you do that, then you get the brain and body firing together and things work a little bit smoother. It's also a big, basically, the term neuroplasticity, the ability for the brain to warm up and it absorbs and executes things at a higher level. That's a big part of what you use that ball handling overload for as well. We know that peak level of stimulus within the brain typically lasts 20 to 30 minutes. So in a workout, if you're going 90 minutes, you probably go through an initial stimulus, then about 25 minutes into it, you go through another 90 seconds to 2 minutes of stimulus, and then another 30 minutes later, you go through the same thing, just to keep the brain really active and making sure that the player is engaged. So that's what that stuff is used for. And you have to have a higher understanding, and you got to be able to look past the drill to understand why you do it when you do it, because the why has to be bigger than the what. If you don't understand why you're doing it, you probably shouldn't be doing it. The why has to be larger than the what, and we have to know why we do what we do in order to win. And that's a big thing for us. And we know, we understand that the drills and things are designed to make sure we get as much out of every single workout as we can. And again, we have to do it in a way where we're not putting a lot of additional mileage on his body. At this point in his career, we have to really value every step he takes. We have to value every dribble he makes. We have to value every shot he takes. And they all have to be moving us in a direction that's going to help us stay at peak levels for as long as we possibly can. And to use science and technology is a really effective way for us to put metrics on things to make sure we're continuing to move in a positive direction.
So fascinating hearing you talk about neuroplasticity and obviously the adaptation and response to experience that happens over time. Maybe give us a perspective on how you train towards that for younger players, particularly relative to what you mentioned already, is trying to get these corrections to be permanent. So moving from retrieval practice to permanence.
So with younger players, it's a little bit different because the skill level is lower. So you have to be careful of adding too much stimulus to where the overload is so great that they can't even execute the most simple form of the overload. So it's a building process. You can't I see it all the time when I'm at these tournaments. I see people trying to take kids that struggle to dribble the ball with their left hand, and they're trying to put them through a tennis ball drill. They're trying to do a 2-ball drill. And I'm just like, it's not really productive right now. So for that kid, because they're still struggling with one ball, the way you would overload that is you would use a heavy ball. You would use a heavier ball to overload that simple movement of just dribbling a ball with their left hand. And typically when you're trying to acquire a skill, you're going to go 2-to-1 contrast to load. So if you had the player dribble the heavy ball 10 times with their left hand, you would contrast that with a game ball 20 times. So it's a 2-to-1 ratio to acquire the skill. And that's kind of the formula that we follow with overload and contrast of skill, specifically with ball handling. You've got to acquire the skill before you can start to load it, and then you start to load it a little more and a little more. And with Stefan, we load it in a lot of different ways now. We have light technology. We put we have things we do on an iPad with them. We have things that force them to think. We have things where he's doing something and all of a sudden we'll yell out a breathing pattern where he has to change his breathing pattern. We're constantly throwing stimulus at him to overload what becomes easy for him, because you do adapt to the stimulus, you do adapt to the overload. So you have to constantly start to add things on there to make sure that you're still in that activation phase.
Least anyone think it's simple to coach a player like that. I mean, we know it, like it's impossible to replicate the game conditions in which he plays in a practice setting. And that's why you're talking so much about overload and throwing different things at him to be able to increase the demands on someone who's that good.
Well, not only that, but we're also working on his processing speed mentally in game situations. He controls the game and he has to make so many decisions on the floor that we constantly have to challenge him mentally with the ball in his hands. We have to make him think. We have to force him to make decisions. We have to force him to change and react to the information that we present to him in stationary settings, because that helps him in game situations when something changes in front of him. When all of a sudden a ball screen coverage changes, or there's a switch, or there's a matchup he wants to get to for somebody else. Those are things where he's got to make really quick decisions. He has to see it, he has to process the information, he has to react to it, and those are the things that we're trying to replicate in his workouts. And I think we do a pretty good job of it.
Well, it shows in his results, obviously, too. And on air, you've mentioned a few times shooting on air, you want this 7 out of 10. So can you talk about what the
Minimum.
next progression is beyond that in terms of overloading them once they get good at on air?
Well, I mean, so we start with shooting against air. Obviously, catch and shoot is kind of your base, right? And then we go to a right hand pickup. So I mean, that would be your first progression is picking the ball up with your right hand off the ground. Then we go to a left hand pickup, and then we go from a right hand pickup with vertical footwork to a right hand pickup getting 1-2 downhill. Then a left hand pickup getting 1-2 downhill. Then a right hand pickup with a right lateral sidestep. Then a left hand pickup with a left lateral sidestep. Then a right hand pickup off of a right foot step back and a left hand pickup off a left foot step back. So you start in the most simple form and with the most simple movements, and then you start to add again those variables and making sure that, all right, if you can make 7 out of 10 catching and shooting, can you make 7 out of 10 picking it up vertically in place? Well, now can you make 7 out of 10 getting downhill? Can you make 7 out of 10 going to the side? So adding that variability while maintaining your standards, while maintaining your personal standard as a shooter of making at least 60 to 70 to 80%. I mean, some players are 80% shooters against air. You've got to establish your baseline and you've got to work from there. Can everybody start off by being a 70% reality? For some young players, their standard when they first get started might be 4 out of 10. And then they've got to build themselves up to where they're catch and shoot 5 out of 10. I would argue that I wouldn't get heavy into variability until you are shooting right around that 60 to 70% against air on the catch and shoot. Now you can get into variability in terms of shooting at different ranges, but variability in terms of pickup, variability in terms of being dynamic movement, until you're really shooting at a high clip catch and shoot and shooting at a high clip catch and shoot with variable range, I wouldn't get too deep into being dynamic because you're just going to end up chasing your tail and you're going to end up trying to make a lot of corrections and you're going to go down a tough path there.
Well, and the challenge, of course, is before they even get to a lot of those areas that you mentioned there, they're already playing games. So they're already getting confused by what happens in a game with their shot. So can you talk a little bit about that process?
Well, I think that, with young players and young kids, one of the most effective things you can do is you got to watch the film with them, and you got to have them watch themselves play, because, the one thing that I've always heard from players, and I hear from my sons all the time when I'm pointing something out to them within a workout, is, well, I don't feel that. I don't feel that I'm, it doesn't feel like I'm doing that. But when you show them the film and you show them, well, no, you are throwing the basketball, or no, you are not getting square, or, you are shooting unbalanced. The eye in the sky doesn't lie, and when you show them the film, it gives them that visual feedback that sometimes they need to make themselves a little bit more coachable. And, coachability with young players is a huge part of becoming a better basketball player. And you're not going to get a lot of buy-in from young girls and young guys a lot of times until they actually see the things that you're saying they're doing on film. So, we all have iPhones now. We all have a smartphone, and as a parent and as a coach, grabbing that game film is just even if you're just filming the possessions that your child is in the game, just grabbing that game film and going back and watching it goes a long way, because then, if something's going on where as a parent or a player you can't figure it out, well, at least you have the game film to go show a professional, go show a trainer, go back to show your coach, this is what's happening in a game. What should I do to make the corrections here? How can I avoid this? But none of that happens if you're not capturing the footage.
Well, and I'm wondering too, if you give them perspective on the fact that there will be a reduction in success from, as you said, some of these 7 out of 10 goals to a game condition. And that applies to Steph, that applies to everyone, right?
Sure. The reason we pick 7 out of 10 and we pick 70% and 80%, because you typically shoot about half, maybe a little less than half of what you shoot against air in game settings. So if you're an 80% shooter against air, you'll probably be around a 40% shooter in game settings. If you're a 70% shooter from the perimeter against air, you're probably going to be hanging out around 35%, 35% in games. If you're shooting less than 70% against air from the perimeter, then you're probably somebody that needs to be driving the basketball to the basket. I think that it's important to help players understand that, even if you're not shooting at an extremely high clip right now, there's still other ways for you to be successful in the game, because discouragement comes in very quickly. Confidence is fleeting with young kids. It comes and goes almost from shot to shot. So making sure that we're pointing out that, even though this isn't going the way you want it to go right now, there are other ways for you to be successful in this game until your shot comes around. There's other ways for you to impact the game until you are shooting the ball better. And then there's some people that never come around to shooting the ball very well, but they're good screeners. They're good ball handlers. They drive it. They finish. They hustle. They defend. They're high IQ players. There's still ways to be very, very good basketball players, very effective basketball players, even if you're not a knockdown shooter. And I think it's important for young players to understand that there are roles in this game, that there are important roles in this game that lie beyond scoring the basketball.
If you do, and when you do, when are you introducing contested or one-on-one or offense versus defense type shooting drills?
Well, I mean, it kind of comes along with that. Okay, now we're doing things at least somewhat dynamically and making a good number of shots. So not putting huge combinations together, but once you get to the point to where you can do like a simple sidestep and knock it down, okay, now we're going to really start to challenge you a little bit. And we might not put live defense against you, but we might put some dummy defense out there where they're just getting a hand up. For the catch and shoot stuff, to contest that, while players are still going through that phase, we do a lot of using, we use something to block their vision. So we have the defenders and all those things where players are working on catch and shoot, to where we've got something in their vision, but it's not a live defender. But like I said, once they start to get to the point where dynamically they're able to make some shots, we'll start to put some hands around them, start to make them feel uncomfortable in landing. That's another thing, being a dynamic shooter, is learning how to land. And as a shooter, for high school, college, and pro players, I'm really big on players understanding that your shot is not finished until that ball goes through the rim. So how you land matters. It matters in a big way, because if your landing is correct, a lot of times it'll kind of reverse engineer some mechanical quirks that you can develop through the season. And it'll keep you, it's an accountability tool for you to keep yourself mechanically sound, making sure that you're landing correctly. And a big part of that is making sure you're creating enough space to get off a clean look, so you do have a clean landing area. So there's a lot that goes into that.
So can you talk a little bit more detail about landing? Do you want them to hold their spot, hold generally, or does that matter as much?
I want you to land on 2 feet.
Yes. Okay.
I'm big on that, because I don't know where it became popular or when it started to become popular for guys to start landing on 1 foot. But man, I see a lot of that. And I see a lot of it at all levels of basketball. And it's kind of funny to me. I mean, typically if you land on 1 foot, it means something didn't go right in the mechanical process of getting that ball off into the shot pocket and getting it out of your hands. But yeah, landing on 2 feet. With Steph, he gets a little bit more leeway than most.
We shot about 1 billion more shots than us, Coach. So I get
he
it.
has,
but the back pedal after he shoots, right? That kids tend to think that's a good thing too.
Yeah, and I'm not a fan of it. I mean, he'll tell you I'm not a fan of it. And there's still, even to this day through this season, where Steph and I have had some extended conversations about landing. Well, you got to land a little bit better. You got to land a little bit cleaner. And you have to value your landing. And the biggest thing is working with intent. So when you go through your workouts, when you're going through your daily workouts, your pregame shooting is understanding, reminding yourself, I got to land and finish, land and finish. And it goes back to footwork, flow, and finish, and not being lazy about your intent as you go through a warm up, not being lazy mentally as you go through a workout, understanding that every part of the shot has equal value and you have to treat it as such. And you have to work with a high level of detail to be a really good game shooter. It's just, there's no way around it. And understanding, every part of the shot's important, and paying a high level of attention to it is a big factor in how much better you get.
Well, I'm glad you said that. Every time I talk to a player about their landing, they point out Steph Curry backpedaling. So I can now say that his trainer agrees with me.
I can tell you that as his trainer, as somebody that's seen him shoot more shots than anybody not named Del Curry, the rules don't always apply to him. He's
Absolutely.
Special. He's different. He can get away with things that nobody else can. He is not the template to use, because a lot of how he shoots the basketball in games has been as a result of what the defense does to you at the NBA level. If you go back and watch him as a college shooter, he wasn't doing a lot of that. He didn't have to do a lot of that stuff. And Coach McKillop wasn't really a guy that was going to allow him to do a lot of that stuff. Now he had a green light, and he got some leeway, but we had to get very creative at the NBA level. You don't have a choice, because that 6'3" guy that was guarding you in college just became 6'7". And oh, by the way, he's faster and more athletic and jumps higher than the 6'3" guy as well. And so the length and everything changed. But the one thing that did not change is the size of the court. So the court essentially shrinks when you get, with bigger, faster players. So your creativity and how you create space becomes a premium product for you, because you've got to be able to do it and get shots off. If you're just going to try to rely on the offense to get you shots in the NBA, especially when somebody's got you marked as a shooter, it's never going to happen for you. And, so things like him embracing the role of a screener. He's a great screener, understanding that if you screen for somebody, a lot of times you get open. And then when you do have the ball in isolation situations where you can't just take one step here or one step there to get a shot off, you've got to set the defender up with something, and you've got to be able to read and get away and land. And with him, in a little bit of a battle landing thing, because he had some injuries early in his career from people getting in his landing space. So it is something he still thinks about. So that's why we have that constant landing reminder for him.
That's great. And you mentioned Del Curry. So obviously a great shooter in and of himself. So I'm wondering, I know you've had these conversations.
More than great.
Yeah, more than great. Yeah, one of the best of all time, arguably. Mm-hmm. So again, you've had these conversations probably with him. What are some of the things that you took away from what he did with his group when he was younger that has stood out to you?
The one thing I've tried to take away from Del is I just admire how he parents those guys. He had all this success as a player, and man, he's his hands. It's surprising, and I try to be more like him as a father. I try to be a little bit more hands off with my kids, and it's a battle I fight. But he's kind of mastered the hands off approach and letting them be pros and letting them kind of go through their own journey. But the one thing that we've taken away from him and Steph already knew how to be a pro before he got there, just from being around his dad. And his dad had to work constantly, because he was a good athlete. He was a great shooter, but he wasn't, keeping his spot in the NBA off of being an athlete. He was keeping his spot in the NBA for as long as being a great shooter. So seeing what it took day in and day out to shoot the ball that way. And I've heard Del talk about how he had to find creative ways to be more competitive within his own workouts. That's been a big driving force behind what we do. And we've had Seth in some workouts with us as well. And when you have both Currys and the workouts, the shooting competitions can go for a long time. We end up in a lot of match situations where, nobody misses for a while. So you see that competitiveness and how important the shooting competitions are to them, because they realize they need that game pressure on them shooting against air in order to make it valuable. And I think that's the biggest thing, I think that I took away from talking to Del is how important when you're working against air, it is to feel game pressure and to have, accountability measures in place to where if you don't succeed against that game pressure against the air, you've got to have a consequence. You've got to have something in place that forces you to really appreciate making shots against that game pressure. And so I think that's what I probably take it away from Del the most.
The problem is those shooting competitions screw up workload management, don't they?
A little bit. It's funny you say that. Yeah, I mean, there are some times where we're kind of looking at the output we're getting from some of the technology. You're like, we should probably stop right about now. But you're not going to stop those guys in the middle of the shooting competition. You're gonna let them finish. But we've gotten better at using technology really at really starting to pinpoint when workouts start to hit diminishing returns now. And the NOAA shooting system has been a big help for us from that standpoint, and being able to track the basketball and being able to plot where the ball is going in the rim. It really helps us understand when he's hitting a point of fatigue and when it's time to stop.
Well, I have to ask some of the things, maybe some of the takeaways about developing creativity and touch around the rim, because I think that's the other
Mhm.
remarkable part about Steph is just the number of creative ways outside of his body, inside of his body, different release points that he's developed over the years.
Yeah, and I think some of that has to do with his ability to protect the basketball with his body, understanding finishing angles, and understanding how to place shot blockers on one side of the rim or the other. Understanding what help's coming from, understanding the personnel that's on the side of the floor that he's driving on. Those are all things that go into being a great finisher as well, because the situation dictates whether you finish it or pass it. But again, he's just got great natural touch. I mean, it's one of those things that, still the rules don't apply to this guy. His touch and feel is just superior. And, at least once a workout, he'll do something with a basketball where you're just like, that shouldn't have gone in, but it did. And you just shake your head because he just has that kind of control over the basketball. But controlling his body, and again, being vertically stacked in his core, not allowing himself to get into flexion or extension when he's driving, that has a big piece of it as well, because he's able to take that contact. We've actually started teaching how to utilize the contact to help you slow down. So, being able to go to full speed, but creating controllable contact, not only to help you slow down, but also to control the shot blockers, to ground the shot blockers. We talk about nailing the shot blockers on the ground with contact. And you do that by creating controllable contact, and you got to be the first person that's doing the hitting. He's really embraced that. And then we started really working hard on that about 5 years ago, 5-6 years ago. He embraced it, and he's just taken it to a whole nother level of creativity. And it's something we still work on now. We have a lot of footwork drills we do around the basket that, you could draw some parallels to the Mikan drills. Is something that we do. It's not the Mikan drill, but we have a series of late jabs and Euro steps that we work on every day, just like a big guy used to work on a Mikan drill every day. We have a series of footwork patterns that we work through every day that are designed to help him control shot blockers and put shot blockers' heads on one side of the rim or the other, understanding where he wants to finish and understanding the reads and where his head's got to be in relationship to the corner of the backboard and the rim as to which finish we use. So it helps to have a really intelligent player, and it helps to have a guy that's extremely detailed. And when you have that, your only limitation is how deeply you're willing to dive into and immersing yourself into helping this guy get better. And it's something you've got to spend a lot of time on every day.
Well, it's really hard to coach a player at that level, but it's also a lot of fun for you, isn't it? Because you can really, really challenge yourself to come up with new ways to challenge him.
Yeah, it's fun because it's you don't really have a lot of limitations. The only limitations we have is we can't be all that creative with the dunks we work on. So, I mean, that's he likes to finish every workout with a couple of dunks, and that's great, but it's not something we spend much time on. And so that's really our only limitation. Outside of that, we can do pretty much anything, and we can force. I mean, there's also been some times where I've put some games together. I've designed some drills and things before a workout, and I'll kind of read through it, and I'll kind of say to myself, well, that's impossible, but we'll let him try it one time. And of course, normally by the second or third time he tries the drill, he beats it. So there are things that just don't look right on paper, just don't sound right when you put them down. But he always seems to find a way relatively quickly to make it look like he's done it his entire life. And that kind of frustrates you because, I kind of look at the workouts as it's me versus him. There have been a few drills that I've created that he hasn't been able to master yet. I kind of count those as wins, but he has a whole lot more wins than I do. So I don't know if I'm being creative enough or difficult enough, but he wins a lot more than I do for sure.
Coach, I know your Instagram at Brandon Payne. I mean, I follow it, and it's been a lot of fun to follow you, and even more fun to talk to you. And then the other part that I just want you to talk about is this underrated tour. When I heard about it, I thought this is a really cool concept, and obviously it really aligns with you and Steph Curry. So can you talk about both those things?
Yeah, it's something that Steph and I started talking about years ago, and we just kind of have seen it come to fruition here in the past few years. Obviously, last year, COVID, or a couple of years ago, COVID kind of disrupted things for us, but we got it restarted in August of 2021. And for us, it's an opportunity that we give to players that are 3-star rated or lower to come and compete. And we're trying to find that next guy that's kind of like Steph, that was a little bit underrated coming out of high school, a little bit overlooked, and guys and girls that are late developing. And we go to 4 regional cities around the country, and we select a team of 8 players from each regional stop. So we go and we have 2 days of competition, and we select the best team, not necessarily the 8 best players, but the best team that represents that particular region. And we make sure we have some shooters. We make sure we have some, dominant lead guards and a big and a stretch 4. We have a format that we like to put them in so that they get to the final stop in the Bay Area, and they compete for the underrated national championship. And it's a really neat thing. And this year, the cities we have a team from Washington, D.C., a team from Chicago, a team from Dallas, and a team from L.A., boys and girls coming to compete. And we'll do that the first weekend of April. We're really looking forward to it. And then we plan on really expanding that underrated concept into younger, the 9th and 10th grade kids. And then from there, we plan on even expanding even further school and with teams and things like that. So it's a big project for us. It's something that we're looking forward to and to growing in the next 5-10 years.
Well, it's stayunderrated.com. Go look it up. It's really cool stuff. And Brandon Payne on Instagram, definitely a must follow for everyone. So, Coach, thanks
at Coach Brandon Payne.
Thanks so much for sharing the game with us.
No problem. Thank you. Thanks for having me.